the cult of Gunther, but I think he's even better in this series than he was in previous ones.
Don't you feel like a team should support its driver and give him confidence?
I'm not saying I agree with this, just to clarify, but he's like, if I never see a Russian again, I'll be happy. Like, when he's dealing with those questions.
That's what points in this season kind of means. It's like pizzas and beers at the end of the night. It's not like, we've defeated our nemesis McLaren.
Katie George, Nate Saunders, Lawrence Edmondson. Full disclosure, the guys are about to head out to Bahrain for testing. So we are pre-recording this before the entire series drops season 5 on Netflix. But thanks to Nate Saunders, we all got a embargoed copy. So we were able to watch the episodes early. I have to say, I felt really, really good about myself getting to watch it early. So I thank you, Nate, for the opportunity.
Yeah, no worries. It's always nice, isn't it, when you can watch something before anyone else does? You feel quite special doing that. And I feel like I've messaged a friend of mine. I was like, "You're really gonna like the new series?" They're like, "Tell me why." And I'm like, "Well, I can't." But I think I only messaged them to lord over the fact that I'd already seen it. So yeah, I definitely felt that.
Yeah, it's a pretty powerful feeling, is it not, Lawrence?
Yeah, I've been sending a few friends in the paddocks or other journalists who maybe haven't got access to it, sending them messages saying, "By the way, you're in this episode, you're in that."
I've done that. I've done that too. Yeah, I've been like, "You look terrible in this scene." But me and Lawrence have the same thing where I was terrified watching it. I was like, "There's going to be a horrible still of me," and I've managed to avoid so far from the ones I've watched. Anyway, I've avoided any embarrassing questions or facial expressions or anything like that.
Yeah, I think I'm in a background of one or two of the later episodes. Just kind of milling around. That's what I do usually. You don't want to be front and center, do you? So.
No, I've paused it a couple times, Lawrence, when I've seen you. I'm like, there he is. Oh, there he is, which I find just so cool. So remember, if you're watching on YouTube, like this video, leave us a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content. And if you're listening, hit us with a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. Let's just dive right in. First 5 episodes, I thoroughly enjoyed. So I would just open it up to the two of you. Lawrence, you start. What were some of the biggest storylines that really piqued your interest? What did you look back on and think, oh yeah, that was super fascinating when it all went down live?
I think especially focusing on the early episodes, you remember how exciting the start of the season was. Because with recency bias, what we experienced at the end of last year with Max Verstappen running away with it by however many points it was and just consecutive victories for Red Bull, it was quite easy to forget how competitive Ferrari were at the start of the year and how much hope there was around Ferrari and Charles Leclerc especially. So that was really brought to light. There's a whole episode on Mick Schumacher as well, which I really enjoyed. I'm sure we'll get into the details of it. But I think that was very telling. Of course, it was a Haas episode, and with Drive to Survive, they do Haas just so well. Gunther Steiner is such a great character. So that's one to look forward to. But I think also I enjoyed this season more than last year's, I think. And I think, having thought about why that was, it's because last year there was so much expectation because 2021 was such an incredible year with such an incredible storyline that to try and do that justice in the Netflix kind of environment, the Netflix narrative, it is actually quite difficult. Whereas this season, picking up some of the storylines which maybe you'd slightly forgot about, and also reflecting on a few things and perhaps spending a little bit more time in the behind the scenes environment, which is where Netflix is so successful, the fly on the wall kind of situations. I think it did that quite well. So having not really enjoyed last year's, this year's I think was a step back in the right direction.
Did you feel the same, Nate?
Yeah, I did. And I completely agree with that. It's just a really good way of putting it. I think that this is exactly what Netflix was made for, is honing in on 5 or 6 moments in what was, an up and down season, had some great moments, had some, it got, as the season went on, it got kind of more entertaining from a competitive point of view. But it did hone in on a few things really, really nicely. I thought that the hope and expectation around Ferrari was great. I think that it was interesting. It kept reminding us, didn't it, how good the British Grand Prix was, because it kind of keeps dipping in and out of that race because it's key to some of those storylines. And it was kind of, that Ferrari episode did kind of leave me a bit kind of frustrated because I was like, oh yeah, man, like it was so good. It was so good at the start. And a great advert for the Dolomites in Italy as well. That opening scene with Gunther and Mattia just like having a glass of wine, like out in the hills in Italy, it's not too far away from where my nonna's from. So I was like, I need to get back out there at some point and practice my terrible Italian. But yeah, so I really liked that. I thought that the Schumacher episode was probably the best one of the first five. I think that's when you saw the most kind of candid stuff between Driver, between Steiner. There's bits of Magnussen in there as well. Yeah, and I mean, one thing it always does grind me a bit with Netflix is they've obviously recorded commentary later in, down the line, which is Jack Nichols, who works at the BBC. Jack's a great guy, but he's obviously, he's recording that to help the narrative along. I totally get why, but for me, I'm just like, I know Jack wouldn't have been commentating on Mick Schumacher in 20th in this race. So that, from a journalistic point of view, frustrates me. But I think if you're watching it and you don't quite know what's going on and what you're looking at, I totally get why that is the case. So that's just me being a really boring kind of guy that works in the sport. So I think the Mick thing was great. And yeah, I think that, to be honest, I didn't think Gunther could get kind of any more kind of wrapped up in like the cult of Gunther, but I think he's even better in this series than he was in previous ones. I think he's as candid. He makes comments about, he says, I mean, I'm not saying I agree with this, just to clarify, but he's like, if I never see a Russian again, I'll be happy. Like, when he's dealing with all those questions, he says some pretty outrageous things about Mick, which is what he did about Mazepin, in the season before. So I think that he's so raw. He adds so much to it. And same to be said of Christian as well. Christian kind of up to no good. But also I think actually was probably on the right side of that meeting, which I'm sure we'll get into more.
Yeah, for sure.
But Christian plays it, doesn't he? I mean, even some of the comments when he's in the garage and he says stuff like, "Oh, it's so good to see a number one in the car," and and they're on the car and they're already in Bahrain. You're like, he never said that. Goodness, no team principal walks into the garage and goes, "It's good to see a number one."
And he's like, "No,
he knows he's got the live microphone there, and he's like,
"Yeah,
right, this is a comment that's going to get into Netflix. This is, And so at times, or maybe he is like that, and it's just the way that team principals acting.
No, Christian, I think Christian is always 100% sure that he knows the camera. I mean, they know the cameras are there anyway, don't they? But I think he's got like a sixth sense for that. He must be like, the cameras right over there.
He for sure does.
Yeah.
He's very good at it. Which you need savvy people like that, I feel like, to spin a season forward. And he does his job well. I agree with you guys. I enjoyed season 4 tremendously. I thought there were a couple gripes that I had, and I mentioned that last week, felt like we saw the same races over and over again. This year, or this season, I thought has been really well done. So I want to hit you guys with a couple questions. You guys mentioned the Mick episode. So that's episode 4, Like Father, Like Son. And it obviously goes through the struggles that Mick has throughout the season, a couple of his massive wrecks that were very expensive. And we know for a team like Haas, they just don't have an outrageous budget to turn to. I did find it really interesting, though, when Gunther went out and he had an interview with Sky Germany. And the Germans' questions were interesting, where he said, don't you feel like a team should support its driver and give him confidence? And so it made me feel like, well, maybe the narrative in Germany is different in terms of how they're covering Mick as compared to, what's been portrayed from Haas's standpoint of like, this guy's not getting us points and he's costing us a lot of money. So maybe we need to contemplate, moving on. From your all's vantage point, when all this was going down, did you feel like there was a different narrative happening in Germany as compared to how they were, covering Mick and the Schumacher family?
Yeah, absolutely. And you got to remember, Mick was the big hope for Germany as well going forward. Seb, of course, was on the grid as well last year, but it was clear he was coming towards the end of his career. And then we found out that it was the last season of his career. So there was so much on Mick to basically fill those boots, become the next big German hope going forward. And his uncle, Ralf Schumacher, is one of the commentary team on Sky Sports Germany. And therefore, I think spends quite a lot of time kind of promoting his nephew as you would, right, in that situation. And of course, there's so much love for the Schumacher name in Germany as well. So there were all these things. I think it is a very different narrative that you get. And in the UK and in the US, I actually think I mean, people will disagree with this, I'm sure, but I think it's a little bit more balanced. I'm sure lots of people will say, if you listen to Sky Sports, they're big fans of Lewis and the rest of it. And perhaps there's some truth to that. But I think it is a little bit more balanced. Whereas if you go to, some countries, or you talk to some journalists from countries, we have a very good friend who's a Danish journalist, a guy called Jonas Huttel, and he really is on Kevin Magnussen watch throughout the weekend. To the point that if you have any question about what has happened at Haas during the weekend, there's only one man you go to in the media center, because Jonas is going to know the answer. So
and they can be super specific as well, can't they? Like, what happened to him turn 7 on lap 18, and he'll be like, "Oh, this happened," straight away. Like, it's like, I know.
Wow.
Yeah, and there's no shame in that, because for his audience, the interest is Kevin. They want to know what's going on with Kevin. Especially the story last year, which was fantastic and made up a bit of, I think, episode 1 this year of Drive to Survive. So yeah, I think that's entirely normal. But that's a really good observation, Katie, that that interview kind of went that way, and then also Gunter's reaction to it. Of course, he's got a very holistic approach. But the thing at that stage as well was that it was clear, at Baku, but actually before that they'd already fallen out of love with Mick. He had his 2 big accidents in Saudi and Monaco, and there's the great quote from Gene where he said, that's dead man walking territory. And you're like, bloody hell, that's serious. In Monaco, they were already saying it, like Mick was on his way out. So that's, again, this is what Netflix does really well. It opens up the door slightly, because when we were asking Gunter those questions at that time of year, he was like, well, if Mick performs well enough, he's got the seat next year.
Sure.
Nico Hülkenberg had barely been talked about that stage as a potential replacement. So that's where it's really good at opening the door slightly, showing you what was really going on at that time.
I will say one of my favorite quotes, lines from it, is with Gunther says, he's so blanking slow, he doesn't need to brake, which is just like, oh my gosh, like the fact that that's being said. But I think that obviously shows you kind of where they were at, Nate.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, I think it is interesting to see that veil pulled back, because I think one of the things that was definitely happening with the Haas and Schumacher situation, as Lawrence has alluded to there, people kind of write around what your audience is. But I think Mick and his manager were probably saying one thing to the German press and being much more open, probably briefing them a bit more off record, like, hey, look, we actually think we're getting a rough deal here. Whereas Haas and the team were probably coming to guys like myself and saying, well, actually, we think it's this way round and stuff. And you're like, okay, well, for me, I'm not going to get that candid answer from Mick. So, you end up thinking, okay, well, you try and find out, what the truth is. So it was interesting. I think there was a lot of briefing back and forth, and that, for anybody listening who doesn't know what I mean, that's kind of the lifeblood of journalism, isn't it? Is one person tells a journalist something and you're like, okay, that's interesting, but clearly there's 2 sides to this story. I think what was clear from the first couple of races, really, as soon as Kevin got into that car, or the other car, and was as competitive as he was, I think that's the key part of the equation. Is that I think there was already some frustrations last year with maybe not so much Mick, and I think I've touched on this before, but kind of the environment around Mick. We mentioned about his manager before, Sabine Kem, who was Michael's manager. Nothing against her, because she seems very nice to deal with, but I think that she treated being Mick's manager in the same way that she treated being Michael's manager. And Haas were like, well, actually, this is just a kid who's not actually won any races. Until Silverstone hadn't actually scored any points. So I think that had grated at the team. Then Kevin came in, got all those great results while Mick was destroying the car. They had shortage of parts and stuff like that. And it's an unforgiving business. And that's I'm not saying an unforgiving team, but it's a team where you can't afford to be sentimental. You can't be like, oh, well, his surname's Schumacher. So I think that it was clear pretty early on that, that Mick was in trouble. I think, and this is one of the things where you can't verify it, but I'm pretty sure that early in the season, there was an attempt to have a meeting between Gunther and Mick, and it depends on who you hear different sides. Either Mick was late for the meeting or Mick didn't show for the meeting. Either way, it rubbed just the one person in the paddock you probably don't want to do that to is to Gunther, because he's a very traditional kind of old school guy. Mm-hmm. And he's like, look, I set this meeting up so we can talk. And if you can't even be bothered to show up on time, that's a problem. So I think things like that on their own were probably fine. But if you're putting them all together and he's not scoring points, then I think it's kind of a recipe for not disaster, but it's a recipe for losing, or dead man walking territory, as Lawrence pointed out, that Gene said. But it was fascinating because Gunther, it shows you how good Gunther's poker face is, because we were asking him, as Lawrence mentioned then, we were asking him about Hulkenberg, we were asking him about Ricciardo, we were asking him about all these things, and they're all mentioned in this, and it seems to suggest it was all in Silverstone that started talking about it, which is obviously kind of mid-season, maybe just before mid-season. So it was everything was kind of, I guess, cascading away from Schumacher before we really realized that was the case.
Well, you mentioned Daniel Ricciardo. There is a line where he's asked if they would consider bringing Ricciardo in for that seat. And what was the line? He's asking for effing $10 million.
Effing 10 million, yeah. And apparently, so again, this is where it's interesting what you hear from the paddock. So I think it was the Hungarian Grand Prix weekend, but ahead of that race, Gunther messaged Daniel to just kind of say, hey, what's your situation for next year? And the story goes that either so again, this is where you kind of hear different takes from different people. Either Ricciardo said to him, look, just talk to my team. He's represented by CAA and he's got agents and stuff like that. Or Ricciardo completely blanked him and didn't reply to the message, which again, the one person you don't do that to in the paddock probably, I mean, you probably don't do that to anyone in the paddock, but Gunther Steiner probably takes that very, very personally. And when Ricciardo was clearly in the market for quite a bit of money anyway, and I don't think his heart was in the right place, I think that kind of immediately drew the line under that. But that would have been, I was excited about that. So when Ricciardo left McLaren, I was like, if he goes to Haas next year, imagine that. Netflix, Gunther, Daniel. But it's a shame that it didn't really go anywhere.
Well, as Mattia Binotto so perfectly coined, Gunther Steiner is the protagonist of Drive to Survive. He is the leading man. And I have to be honest, I was sad when we opened up the season with episode 1 and it's Gunther and it's Mattia and this cute little buggy, by the way, going through the Dolomites to a vineyard that I believe Mattia owns. But it made me sad thinking, gosh, we're not going to have a world with Mattia in it moving forward. Like I just, as a fan, really always enjoyed watching him, listening to him. And then we get into episode 3, which is Matter of Principle, where they kind of dive into Ferrari's struggles. Well, triumphs in the beginning, but then quick struggles with some of the strategy. I wish, Lawrence, that one conversation where they kind of screwed Charles Leclerc by not bringing him in to change his tires, where he's kind of pointing in Charles' face. Remember, and that blew up in that point of the season when it happened. And didn't they say afterwards, well, it was a happy conversation or something? It was a friendly conversation. It's like, I've never had a friendly conversation with somebody wagging their finger in my face. But I wish that was a moment where we had the mics on, and maybe they did, and they just decided, you know what, this is too close to home. But I kind of wish we got to see a little bit behind the curtains more so than we did in that Ferrari episode. How do you feel, Lawrence?
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think it was very much a PR managed kind of episode, wasn't it? Whereas perhaps Haas give Netflix more freedom to do what they want at the end of it. Because as we mentioned before in the last episode of this podcast, the teams do get some say over what goes out at the end of it, which kind of takes some of away from it being a true documentary and more of a kind of PR exercise, but still. But I think the one thing that came away from that Ferrari episode and Mattia is that he is a very, very nice and calm individual, isn't he? He's really got a certain way of managing, and it was often, well, this is something to learn. This is something to learn from the mistakes we're making. But you can also look at that and start to understand why Ferrari maybe felt that he wasn't the right man for the job, because even though he consistently said they had something to learn, and they certainly did from those situations, they never really put those learnings into practice. And as a result, the mistakes kept happening. So there was also in that episode, it was before the race, and they were talking about strategy and how important it would be. And Mattia kind of goes, we will have to bite, and then I'm counting on you. But he says it in this very quiet, monotone voice, and you're like, "Come on, this is not the dressing room kind of like."
It's like it's like he's kind of whispering it, isn't it? He's like he's kind of, he doesn't want the drivers to actually hear that. He's like, "Okay, I've said it, but I don't need them to hear it."
And F1 is different to other sports like that. It's not quite the same as a football dressing room, but still, you can understand why maybe questions were being asked. Is this guy is clearly a very talented engineer, clearly a very calming influence, and a very good at leading the team in certain directions. But is he the man who's actually going to stand up, or the person who's going to stand up and motivate them in the right way, and then also make the really tough decisions when they need to. Because in that race, you know, in the break, so the red flag break, Red Bull are talking about how, well, Ferrari are going to prioritize Charles, aren't they? They're going to prioritize Charles. Maybe they'll sacrifice Carlos. And then the reality is that Ferrari actually do the opposite. They prioritize Carlos, I think by mistake, in reality, but they still did that. And then at the end of it, Red Bull can't quite believe how lucky they've been. And, you know, and that really was the story of so many races this year. And so, I think that's the side of Mattia, which unfortunately maybe got a bit exposed. And again, I think, you know, it helps to cast it in a light now that we know that he's gone. And of course, when he's doing when he's doing all of those interviews, I think he doesn't know that he's going to leave at the end of the year, apart from maybe the very ones at the end of the series. And so, it does cast it in a slightly different light, and maybe a bit of an understanding as to why Ferrari went the way they did with the decision.
Fair. Speaking of sides being exposed, episode 2 follows Mercedes, and the episode's called Bounce Back, which I think is a clever play on words, obviously, because they had such porpoising issues early on, but they did kind of get their stuff together and bounce back towards the latter part of the season. That's not a version of Toto Wolff that I'm used to seeing, right? Obviously, I think F1 and the personalities in it were gifted with the fact that they're pretty vulnerable in certain situations. Toto Wolff's used to having success at the highest level. Now, obviously, they've put together a car that, you know, isn't performing to the best of its ability, and they're struggling. And so you can obviously see that bubbling of frustration. And Nate, you alluded to the team principal meeting where things get super heated and Toto Wolff's yelling. Christian Horner, of course, has a pretty great line in there, which I'm sure he knew. I'm sure all of them knew that the cameras were in there. But what did you kind of make of Toto Wolff's reaction and how he handled the struggles that were for Mercedes a season ago? And did you get that kind of sense from him, you guys, when you were around him during that time last season?
I think Toto, we've talked haven't we, before about the different management styles between Red Bull and Mercedes. But I think that fundamentally, one of the reasons that Horner and Wolff are so successful is the way they, I think, better than any other team principal, will defend their team's kind of position. And you see that in that meeting really well. You know, Toto's kind of coming in there and saying we need, you know, for safety, because it was the race after Lewis had basically got out of the car and had all the back issues and stuff. And yeah, you're right. Horner's like, well, you should just fix your car, you know, which is a bit cheeky to say, but at the same time, you can totally understand it from Horner's perspective, because he'd be like, okay, it's convenient that now this was what Red Bull were thinking at the time, is that it was convenient now that, you know, now you're saying that these, you know, the car's not safe because it's bouncing around. We've all managed to fix the issues, you haven't. At the same time, Mercedes, you can totally understand their point of view. They're like, well, look, if our driver's getting out of the car and he can barely stand up, something has to be done about it. But because of the situation between those two teams over the last few years and the animosity between those two guys, it's completely different. You know, the context is gone. And I thought it was great. I mean, I'm so glad that bit was in the episode, because I was in Canada for the race, and speaking to Christian on the Sunday before he started the meeting, his post-race debrief, he was already talking to a couple of journalists from British newspapers, came in, and he was like, I really hope Netflix does show what we, you know, this meeting we had the other day here, because he was like, I couldn't believe. And I thought, I was like, you know, you always take that with a pinch of salt. You think, okay, well, it could just be Christian being Christian. It could not be as bad as it was. But you can see the faces of the other team bosses through that. You know, they're just kind of like, wow, this is happening. And Domenicali's sitting there like, I don't know what to do. But I think it was great, because I think that shows you that for all of their talk, those two guys will kind of go toe to toe with each other like that in that situation, which
I feel like the roles were reversed too.
Yeah, and
Same
Horner
thing would
also,
be done.
Yeah, and Horner does allude to that as well, doesn't he? I forget the exact wording of it, but he says, you know, when you've created a great car for so long and then you don't, suddenly, you know, anxiety and doubt creeps in. And it's actually, the way he said that was the first time I ever thought that he showed sort of a degree of empathy for Toto's situation. He wasn't kind of lording that over him at that point. He was like, no, you know, you can end up doubting yourself. You can end up doing that. And then there's like, I can't remember exactly what he says straight after that, but it's like he's back to like there's like the smile at the, you know, it's smile in the corner of his mouth and stuff. So, you know, he's enjoying the situation. And I think he's trying to not enjoy it enough that pisses Toto off. But yeah, to be honest with you, I could watch a whole show of just those two guys, you know, like locked in a room together. I could also watch, just going back to what we talked about before, I could also watch a whole show of Mattia and Gunther just driving around Italy in a tiny car. So I think those two shows on their own, if it just went between those two things, you could have like the happiness of Gunther and Mattia, and then the tension and the unbearable kind of arguments between Toto and Christian. I think that alone would be a show that does just amazing ratings, because it's just really cool to see. Because again, when we ask them questions about this, often they're trying to play it down, or they're trying to shift the blame onto the other guy.
Do you think you could watch a spinoff of Otmar Safnauer and Zach Brown, Lawrence?
Speaking French to himself in the car.
Yeah, as long as it isn't Otmar doing the ironing. I think there is a man who has never ironed a shirt in silver.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't iron much, but I know that that's not how you iron a shirt like that.
Yeah, and then he kind of pulls off. He's like, pulls off the ironing board. He's like, oh no, that's no good. I have to do that again. So that's episode 5, isn't it? I feel like that episode, and a bit of a spoiler alert here for anyone who hasn't made it on 6, but those 5 and 6 are together, and it's all about the driver market and how Oscar Piastri goes from Alpine to McLaren. And that was genuinely a big deal in the paddock. And it created a lot of tension between those two teams, and I think a lot of animosity between those two people, Zach Brown and Otmar Safnauer. But beforehand, when they're trying to build it up, and this is like classic Netflix stuff, when they're trying to build it up with, it's the French Grand Prix and McLaren and Alpine going tied on points. No one cares. No one was talking about that.
Yeah, they don't need to do that. I wish they didn't do that, because it just is unnecessary.
Yeah, but and then that's it. So that kind of stuff was, I think, going too far, and it was really when it kicked off around Hungary, which I felt was pretty well dealt with. There were some great Fernando Alonso quotes, who sets the scene right from the very start by saying that he's part of the dark side and he's going to play up to that. And then he knows exactly what he's doing, Fernando. He's great at kind of building this up, and he does it with tongue in cheek and a kind of smile, knowing that I think a lot of the media kind of like to portray him that way anyway, so he's just going to lean into it. So yeah, that stuff was great, but I feel like more time spent on the real nitty-gritty of how it all kind of fell apart, and getting some of the kind of live mic stuff they got later in the series. That's good. What's not so good is trying to build up this on-track rivalry, when at the end of it, I think it's summed up after the Hungarian Grand Prix, where Alan Permain says to Kyron Pilburn on the Alpine pit wall, great, now we can go for a pizza because we scored points. Like, that's what points at mid-season kind of means. It's like pizzas and beers at the end of the night. It's not like, we've defeated our nemesis McLaren. I think that's where like Netflix sometimes gets a bit frustrating and tedious when they're kind of building up that stuff. But
which I think is fair.
Yeah, and I totally get why they do it, but it especially, I think, and this is where, for Lawrence and I working in it every day, you go in with a bit more of a cynical take on it. I love that Alonso has kind of lent into that in this episode. I loved as well, I think it's right at the end of the episode when they've obviously announced he's left the team. I mean, that whole sequence is great, because you see them giving him that birthday cake for 41, and Otmar's trying so hard to kind of be nice. He's like, 41 for number 14, and Fernando's like, yep, yeah, it's good numbers. But you can see on his face, like, he's clearly already spoken to Lawrence Stroll at that point. He's clearly, and again, we've seen this with Alonso time and time again in his career, where he's, there's always, I think Fernando's always playing a long game, but he's also got a few short games going on as well. And then they have that talk on the balcony, and I think what Otmar's saying to him is, I'll give you the contract today or tomorrow. And Fernando's like, well, I'll sign it tomorrow. I think is what he's saying. Or he's like, what about tomorrow? And we know, of course, he didn't sign it in Hungary, and he told the team, look, I'll sign it, in the break. And then that evening is when it sounds like he signed the Aston Martin deal. And so I just thought that knowing that about Fernando, and then seeing the way he was with Otmar there, was really interesting. And there's that great line when he's talking to the camera, when he's like, yep, bye-bye, I'm the bad guy. And I think that he has embraced it, and I think it's a good thing to embrace, because it suits him very well. He's very good at that kind of devious but kind of cool bad guy. He'd make like a good Bond villain. He's scheming, but on one point you're like, I kind of like this guy. He's kind of cool. He's kind of suave and sophisticated, but at the same time, like, his intentions, you never know what they are. So I think he's played that perfectly. And he's kind of joined the great team for that. I think Aston Martin, Lawrence Stroll is kind of, one of the dark, now that Seb's gone from that team, I think it is kind of a dark side team as well. So
I'll never fault a driver for securing their future and doing what they think is best for them and their family. You could say that about all kinds of different athletes. I do find it fascinating that Alpine was so blindsided by Fernando obviously leaving, and then obviously the debacle that was Oscar Piastri. I know it's a shrewd business. I know that there's ruthlessness to this. Who do you fault more? Alpine for not having any idea that either of these things were coming, or just the fact that, you know what, individuals do what individuals have to do? Like, how do you guys see it in this world?
I think Alpine completely fit bottom myself.
So it's not really fair to blame it on Otmar. Otmar was kind of the firefighter in that situation. These deals were put in place by before Otmar kind of arrived on the scene. So yeah, the fact that Piastri didn't have a clear contract whereby he was kind of forbidden from talking to other people on the grid, had a contract locked in for the following year, no matter where Alpine chose to put him, would have been, seems to me like, the very basics of dealing with a young driver. So I think Alpine got caught there, maybe trusting him a bit too much. I don't know, but if anything, I think it's just being a bit sloppy, really, behind the scenes. And then with Fernando, well, I don't really blame Alpine for the Fernando situation, because they gave him a car that progressed on the previous year. They didn't really do a huge amount. Okay, the car was a little bit unreliable, but you get that at teams, especially teams which are trying to push the limits. So with the Fernando situation, I think it is just one of those situations. If you have Fernando in your team and his contract's coming to an end, you never make any assumptions that you've got him until you've got it signed on a piece of paper. And there's that moment in episode 5 where Fernando's going up to one of the offices in Alpine, and they've got the mic on Otmar, and he's like, yeah, I might sign today, might sign tomorrow. And then at that point, having watching it now with the benefit of hindsight, he's already probably signed an Aston Martin contract or is on the verge of doing so. So it's great. And then just before the race, they have Otmar talking to Laurent Rossi via his kind of iPhone earbuds, and he's talking about how, there's been a meeting and this kind of stuff. So at that point, it twigs for Otmar, oh God, we've got a situation whereby Fernando could well be leaving. And then I bet, that was probably the first time when they were seriously considering, right, what's our Oscar Piastri contract looking like for getting him in the Alpine? Because prior to that, they've been trying to maneuver him into a Williams seat. So it all happened very quickly for them, and triggered by Fernando. But I don't blame Otmar, and I think he kind of comes out quite well from this. I agree. Series. He is a very engaging and kind of friendly character, and I think that kind of comes across well. So I think that he learned a lot of lessons during that period, but they weren't from mistakes of his own making. It was from previous management decisions at Alpine.
I agree he comes off well, but I felt so bad when on that Sunday evening they show him going to that BWT event, and they were like, "Oh, Otmar, you're our hero, and that at the same time Aston Martin were preparing for this press release that went out the following morning. It kind of had a, not to overplay it too much, but it had like a Shakespearean kind of drama element to it where he had no idea, and he's being all jovial and probably thinking, okay, things are okay, I think. I think just on that point, I think Mercedes will have a similar situation with this whenever Lewis is kind of close to leaving and they're not sure if he will, because you always have that conundrum in Formula One. If you have a great driver, you're like, we want to keep the great driver here, but you've got to look at the future as well. And I think Alpine kind of second guess themselves, like, we do have one of the best drivers of this era, but we also have, I thought the great bit in that episode that was actually kind of a small, kind of not throwaway bit, but it was, a very quick interview, is Horner saying how much he regrets that Red Bull didn't get Piastri. And he said, this guy's could be the next Verstappen. And I think that is a really interesting take from somebody who's worked with so many great drivers to say that. And that does make you wonder, if Piastri's as good as everyone says he is, and everyone I've spoken to who knows his career say, this guy is really, really good. You can understand the situation they were in, because they're like, right, we've got to keep Oscar here, but how do you get rid of Fernando Alonso and keep the team on the good path that it's on? You don't want to throw Piastri into that situation. But it was a complete mess from them last year. So it's a great example of how not to elevate a young driver to your team. What about you, Katie? From the outside and looking at that show, what did you make of that whole situation, because I think that it's interesting. I haven't seen 6 yet. I will get to that, but I'm interested to see how Piastri comes off, because I felt for Piastri in a way, because before he'd even driven a Formula One car, he'd had this whole summer where the whole news cycle was just about him. And he's not even raced yet.
People probably have drawn conclusions or perceptions about him as an individual before he even races, which I think is a very good point. From the outside, I think I fault Alpine to a degree, like, gosh, you had to have seen it coming. But then at the same time, it's hard to fault them because individuals, I think, do so many things behind the scenes, as you guys have both mentioned. Like, these deals and conversations are going on without other people knowing. And so Fernando Alonso, I kind of want to say, like, fool me once, shame on me, or, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on, like, Alpine kind of, what you were dealing with. Like, he's done this before. Yeah. So
well, that's a really good point.
I didn't feel like that was shocking. Number one, the Piastri thing I thought was like just a total debacle, but I do think that Alpine feels good about where they are, and they, are getting Pierre Gasly, which I do think that Pierre could be a star. So I don't know. I just think it was so fascinating. So I was curious what you guys thought on the ground, but it just did appear like, these are two guys who made really shrewd, kind of selfish moves for themselves. And you wonder where the loyalty is. But at the same time, I don't know if the end all be all is loyalty. So like, I think when we get in, go ahead, Lawrence.
No, I was going to say it's a really interesting point, because if you look at Fernando's career, none of it's been based on loyalty. And he's a 2-time world champion. If you look at Lewis Hamilton's career, it's almost entirely been based on loyalty, and he's a 7-time world champion. So obviously it depends on who you're loyal to and the bridges you build and stuff like that. But I think it's very interesting, because the nature, I think, of a lot of these drivers is to be very selfish. At some stages in their career, they all have to be, there's no helping out your teammate, early in the season, because you're only going to fall more points behind. And then at some point, the team's going to start backing your teammate and not you. And then you need to start worrying about, your contract the following year. So you can understand why they are selfish, but it is interesting to look at different drivers and different career trajectories. But yeah, from Alpine's perspective, to not suspect that Fernando would be selfish is to basically ignore all of Fernando Alonso's career to that point.
Yeah, I think that if I was, sorry, Katie.
No, go ahead.
I think if I was Otmar Safnauer and I didn't get a straight answer at that point from Fernando, I'd have been on the phone to Laurent Rossi.
He's doing something behind our backs.
I'd have been like, look, we have to make sure we don't leave this paddock without a yes or no from him. We can't end up doing this, because the story went that we spoke about it in the summer. From everything we understand, is that following day Fernando just kind of went off to the Greek islands on a yacht and was wasn't answering his phone. Otmar, people at Alpine are trying to call him. There was a press conference with Otmar where he said, "Yeah, I can't. I haven't spoken to Fernando. We can't get hold of him." And you just think, how that is such a crazy situation. And then again, to lead into this bad guy thing of Fernando, I love the fact that he then just waltzed back into the paddock in Belgium and was like, "Hey guys, how you doing?" And I don't think he had much shame about doing that. And why would he? Because he's, like you said, he's extended his career probably further with Aston Martin than he would have done with Alpine. Kind of gutted they didn't go on that yacht with him. That would have been great. His phone just going off in the background. It's kind of like a scene from Succession or something. That yacht episode where they're all on the yacht and it's all foreboding and it's all very doom. Like doom is in the air.
It was Otmar that said he was on a yacht. And then on Fernando's Instagram, he was in
That's right, yeah,
at the kart track. So it almost seemed like Otmar didn't. I didn't know the exact truth, whether he was on the yacht one day and then Oviedo the next. But it seems like even Otmar had no idea where his driver was. But yeah, it's really great. But that isn't that fantastic. We just spent the last 10 minutes talking about how great that one little section of the episode is. But that's the kind of box office stuff that Fernando brings. And you got to remember, this is a sport as well. If a driver wants to go and do it his way and kind of look back at his career and have no regrets at the end of it, which I'm pretty sure is how Fernando will feel at the end of all this, then so be it.
I thought it was funny when he comes back into the paddock, and I forget who came up to him and was just like, "Well, you've caused a lot of drama. You've shook things up," and he's like, "Blame Seb," and just walked off.
Yeah,
that's true, isn't it? As well, if Seb hadn't retired, it would have been a fairly dull. I mean, Ricciardo probably would have still opened the door for Piastri, I guess. But yeah, the Seb thing really did blow everything wide open. On Piastri, I think the one big criticism I have of this series, and it's purely just because of I think how they framed it. I could not, and I don't know how you guys feel about this. It took me out of the moment when they're showing Piastri, they're doing this montage. You have a very slender, kind of slightly built F1 driver, and they're doing a montage with him, and he's lifting very, very light weights in the gym, and I was like, I get it. Like, you're trying to show him working out, but show him on the treadmill or show him running. You don't really. I know F1 drivers. They're very, very fit. They're way fitter than I am. But it was just a weird visual to see. Like, they were showing that thing at the end, and he's lifting. Very, very, like, I think there was like one bar on each side. It just was it just took me out of the moment for a sec. I was like, oh yeah, this is a bit, frankly.
Yeah, they wanted a really dramatic ending, and the shots didn't really line up. And that made me just think, like, okay, clearly they didn't have a lot of time with Oscar, and they just don't have like a lot of footage of him. So they just used what they did. But Lawrence, you mentioned that episode 6 kind of puts a bow tie on all this. And episode 6 is Nice Guys Finish Last. So that kind of goes into Daniel Ricciardo's future, as well as Piastri making the move to McLaren, what obviously Alpine is going to do from there. Episode 7 is titled The Hot Seat. That goes into Checo Perez and the drama that was at the Monaco Grand Prix and his accident during qualifying, which should certainly be fascinating. Episode 8's Alpha Male with Yuki Tsunoda and Pierre Gasly at that point, obviously making the move. So who's going to move into that seat at AlphaTauri? And then episode 9, I think is just going to be electric because it's titled Over the Limit. And it obviously gets into the accusations that Red Bull went over the budget cap. And then I'm sure episode 10 just kind of puts a bow on everything. So we've got a lot certainly to break down from the last 5 episodes, and we're going to do that next week. But curiously, you guys mentioned just the different personalities, and I think Fernando Alonso certainly is one of those. We're not going to have Daniel Ricciardo on the grid, this coming season. And I have just been watching Full Swing, which is it's by the same creators of Drive to Survive, but it's touring around and following PGA Tour and its golfers. And I do think it's very good. I do think that the personality of the subjects is missing, to put it lightly. And Daniel Ricciardo, as we know, is one of the best personalities in this sport. And so do you think that Drive to Survive will suffer moving forward without him as one of, the main subjects that we get to hear from and see from?
I think so. I think it will take an episode out of, they have a formula now with Drive to Survive. Mm-hmm. And one of those episodes, at least, sometimes 2, is based around Daniel because he is just so good. But Daniel is unique. You're not going to replace him. One of the other drivers is not going to fill the role of Daniel Ricciardo. But that's not to say there aren't other good stories out there they can go after. I mean, there were a number of things which they barely touched on this year. One was the Mazepin situation, which, as Nate mentioned, Gunther gives a kind of throwaway comment, but they don't go into any detail on it. I think that could be an episode in itself. If they were, if it was a serious documentary, they would certainly have covered the Saudi Arabia missile attack and during Friday practice of that race. Doesn't even get a mention, not even, in the Mick episode. It's almost like Saudi Arabia is a lovely place. Here's everyone laughing in the paddock. I can tell you from experience that wasn't the case when we were there. So I think there's still plenty of stuff for them to go to the World Tour over a season. But I think they'll just lose that, that one Daniel Ricciardo episode. Plus, there's always these little filler bits, aren't they? Like, if you notice, every time they go to the start of a race weekend, it's drivers fooling around and all that kind of stuff. And I'd say a good kind of 6 times out of 10, Daniel Ricciardo's involved, like signing the back of someone's shirt or whatever. So yeah, I feel like that's where they'll lose it. But I don't think it doesn't mean you can't have a series. I just think
they're not lacking for content. Also,
he's going to be around next year, and if Red Bull turns into a spicy hotbed of distrust between the drivers, I'm sure we'll have a thing or two to say.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, whenever he's in the paddock, those Netflix cameras are just going to be on him, aren't they? Like, like kind of bees to honey almost, I think. But I think it's going to be interesting to see, though, the way Netflix fills that gap, because I don't think there is a like for like comparison, as Lawrence said. And I think the danger you get is you either have one driver who sits there and thinks, okay, I need to be the new Danny Rick, and they do it kind of falsely. And I think that there are a few people on the grid, Katie, to go to your golfing point, that maybe aren't so great aren't so compelling characters. And the fact is that Netflix hasn't really needed to deal with them because the ones they have dealt with have been great. So it'll be interesting to see what happens when they have to kind of dig into some of the other characters there that maybe don't give you such great quotes, maybe aren't such great fun to be on camera with. I think it was in our show notes. I'll give her a shout out, but Emily Selleck wrote in the New York Post about Netflix looking for Pierre Gasly to be the guy to kind of step up. You can kind of see that, but I think Gasly's a very, very different personality to Ricciardo, and I don't think he's got the same. I mean, he's not got the same sense of humor. He just doesn't have it. He tries to kind of have a laugh and a joke when he can, but he's very, very different to Ricciardo. Ricciardo always feels pretty natural. I think a lot of the other drivers, you see when they're trying to be funny, it is trying to be funny, and I think that's where it might become difficult. But again, like, it's a great opportunity for a young driver to kind of be themselves. I think one of the characters I really hope is featured more and more, just because he's absolutely fantastic, is Tsunoda, because he does not act like anyone else. He just is completely who he is. And he might not be in Formula One much longer because, his results haven't been there, but he's a great guy who I think in the next series of Drive to Survive, assuming he gets to stay for another season beyond that, he could really benefit. So we'll see. But I think it'll be a big loss. And but like Lawrence says, like, that could be, I mean, that's episode 1 next year, isn't it? If Checo isn't driving at Red Bull at the end of the year and Ricciardo's in, doesn't matter what's happened in the championship. For me, that's the episode 1 I want to see, because
no doubt.
Because again, we were talking about selfishness. Ricciardo has that in him as well, like they all do. So as much as he's like that on camera and he's that, that fun-loving guy, if he sees an opportunity to get into that Red Bull, I'm sure he's going to take it like any driver would. And suddenly you might see a different side to him. You might see a different side to other drivers as well. So yeah, always interesting to see like how that would all play out. But we're getting way ahead of ourselves. We're talking about 12 months down the line already.
I know. I feel like we're being pulled in all different directions. We're being taken back to the past. You guys are obviously getting ready for testing. We're obviously talking about the future, but I really enjoyed episodes 1 through 5. Obviously, you guys did too. Great analysis and breakdown. I love the stories of like what we're seeing, obviously, on the show, and you guys being able to draw back to it and give us, side stories from what you were experiencing in that moment. I think is just unbelievable insight. I know I love it, and I hope our viewers and listeners love it too. So remember, if you're watching on YouTube, like our video, leave us a comment. Don't forget to subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content. If you're listening, please hit us with a 5-star review. Both of you, safe travels to Bahrain. We'll be talking to you soon. Cheers.